Trekking in Papua New Guinea along the Kokoda track is not for the faint-hearted. It's hard work and can be very dangerous, with some trekkers paying the ultimate price. Currently, about 8,000 people a year, mainly Australians, make the journey for various reasons. Bill James, Kokoda historian and guide, will accompany Terry Parer on a family pilgrimage. Terry's uncle, World War II cinematographer Damien Parer, whose documentary Kokoda Frontline was to win Australia's first Academy Award.
Damien's films had a great effect on the people of Australia. His images of Kokoda Frontline made it very evident that war was at our doorstep.
If only everybody in Australia could realise that this country is in peril, that the Japanese are a well-equipped and dangerous enemy, we might forget about the trivial things and go ahead with the job of licking them.
Damien was determined to bring the truth about the Kokoda campaign to the Australian public, no matter what the cost. But the truth was not something that the generals and the politicians wanted the Australian people to hear.
Significantly better than your last one.
The Parer family have come to learn more about the Kokoda campaign, Damien's work here, and meet some of the soldiers that he filmed. They've brought with them a plaque to honour Damien and the men of Kokoda, and will find a suitable place on the track to place it.
Well, this is the wartime track, the main line of communication used by the Australians during the war. But the bulk of the Australians and the Japanese use this part here, and it runs up to the top of the Ori-Bio Ridge to the village.
The death of over 2,000 Australians was the equivalent of 2 Bali bombings a week for 6 months, just for that period. The impact on our society was enormous.
How's it going, Terry? Good, good, good.
After arriving at the Kokoda airstrip, the trekkers will head south towards Port Moresby down the rugged 96-kilometre track that saw so much bitter fighting in 1942. They plan to complete the trip in 7 days. They're following the route taken by Australian troops as they withdrew south in the face of overwhelming Japanese force. In July 1942, some of the 39th Militia Battalion from Melbourne were camped in Port Moresby when news of the Japanese invasion came through.
A dispatch rider pulled up on his bike and he handed Colonel Owen a pass, a dispatch. The Japanese have landed at Gona. You'll go back to your companies and be prepared to leave in 24 hours. And that was it.
Kokoda, halfway between Gona on the north coast and Port Moresby in the south, was strategically important because it had an airstrip. This was vital for the supplies of ammunition and food. It was here that the Australians made their first stand against the Japanese, who didn't know that only a handful of Australian soldiers stood between them and Port Moresby.
Weapons just up at Deniki. This is where the battlefield is, and they shot them here. That's where I burned all the skulls of the Japanese in here when we first get this place for the village.
Whereabouts did you do that?
Just here.
Just over there?
Yeah,
okay.
Just close here.
How many skulls were there, do you think?
Oh, it's plenty of skulls and bones and all this.
Right. Of Japanese?
Of Japanese.
Right.
The first engagement between the Australians and the Japanese was at a little place called Awala. That was 3 days after the Japanese landings, 2 or 3 days after the Japanese landings. The Australians attempted to ambush the Japanese but clearly they were outnumbered. They had no option to fall back as quickly as they possibly could to Kokoda and dig in around the plateau. And the first major battle of the campaign took place at Kokoda on the 28th and 29th of July.
We took off down towards Kokoda. The airstrip ran straight away from it. And as I looked, I saw this Japanese, and he was staring up at us, just amazed, I suppose, that anybody was up there. So I had a rifle, some ammunition, so I thought I'll shoot him, see? And I hit the ground between his feet. I saw the bullet hit, and then I saw the fastest thing since the store gift. He rose in the air like that from where he was standing, spun around, and when his foot hit the ground, he went whist!
After recapturing Kokoda, the Australian troops were eventually overrun by superior Japanese numbers. With the odds stacked against them, the Australians withdrew south to Isarava, one of the strongest natural defensive positions on the track.
Most of you back home won't know where we are. It's a long way north up in Papua. I'll write some more when I get some rest. The 39th Battalion is on the move again. For 2 long months and 16 lost mates, drowning in the thunder of this constant August rain. 1 month today I got hit. The shots echoed through the valley, cracking like a whip on the breeze. I can hear you whisper through the trees. I can hear you screaming in my knees. I dream of ghost gums on the rise.
I'll make 2 little legs, actually.
On their own way to Isarava, the trekkers spend their first night on the track with the local people at Hoy village.
Got your name on it.
Going well, Terry. There you go. Going well, going well.
The morning brings a tough climb, and there's a lot more to come over the next 6 days. But the trek party have trained and have physically prepared themselves for the journey.
I want to go home.
Okay, he was saying this, when Australians came in these villages, they are all friendly and they communicate with the village people, but as soon as the Japanese come here, they don't give chance to anybody.
3 of the Australian troops that fought in the campaign have agreed to meet the trek party at the Isarava monument later in the day. And being late is not an option. Back in 1942, when the 39th Battalion were falling back to their defensive position, Damien Parer and his camera were kept busy in Port Moresby, filming the relentless Japanese bombing runs on 7 Mile Airfield and the supply ships in the harbour. He, like many others, was unaware of the titanic battle that was about to take place at Isarava. Getting to Isarava today is easier than in 1942 for veterans Bill Graydon, George Palmer and Keith Norrish. This is their first visit back to Isarava since the war.
We're waiting for a patch of blue, and then
all of a sudden divine intervention intervened and this big hole came up in the clouds. Great, it's going to come through. It was great.
So how does it feel walking down here, George?
Oh, it's tremendous. hard to, hard to believe it's happened, put it that way, yeah.
Just being so peaceful that we're sort of having trouble getting our head around it, really.
There wasn't a lot of peace around in September of 42.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious that we're actually paying to come here.
That's right. It's costing us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean the Japanese, because the whole idea was they had a far superior force by a few thousand. So any time that we made a stand, they could encircle us. And as a result, we'd pull back to the next ridge, inflict casualties when they came up. They'd attempt to encircle, we'd go back to the next ridge. Well, that happened all the way from here, right back to Urubaya.
On behalf of the Parer family and trekkers, I welcome you to the famous battlefield of Ishiwava.
Over 3,000 Japanese had assembled at Isarava to destroy the Australians in a three-pronged attack. The Australians were outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. But the Japanese had not counted on two factors: the Australians' never-say-die attitude and the remarkable leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honour, the new commander of the 39th Battalion.
He came to us when we really needed leaders. We went away, we're all volunteers from Melbourne, and Honour, as I say, he's like a father figure to us. A wonderful man, great inspiration.
Under Honour's command, the 39th held off the Japanese attacks for over a week. But with exhaustion mounting, their valiant stand was close to breaking point as Japanese numbers increased. Reinforcements were desperately needed.
I'm buggered. My knees are killing me. I'm getting frustrated.
Although short on rations due to enemy bombings in Port Moresby, fresh troops from the 21st Battalion eventually made their way up the track and reinforced the beleaguered 39th Battalion on the 26th of August.
They were sent later on when they got in trouble, that the Japs had overwhelming numbers, overwhelming firepower, and we were sent over to help to relieve the 39th Battalion. The Japs had something like their strength had built up to at least 6,000 to 8,000, and they were against a battalion that had been at that stage down to about 300, and our battalion was then 540, and they had mountain guns, they had heavy mortars and heavy woodpecker machine guns, none of which we had at that time. We just had the Bren guns, our Owen guns, and our rifles and grenades. That's about all, and bayonets.
It's actually a tremendous coincidence that the 21st Brigade got here virtually as soon as the main Japanese attack commenced.
Right. Yeah.
They had been, probing for some time previously, been building up their force here to say 5,000 men or something like that, or something in addition to that. And the moment the 21st Brigade got here, they commenced the attack.
And Colonel Honour stated that another 24 hours without the 2nd 14th, and you fellas would have been overrun.
They would charge, and then all of a sudden they'd retreat. And within another, say, half hour or so, hard to tell, they'd come back again, and there just seemed to be just as many.
I'd heard by some of the wounded that the Butch had been hit badly. I could tell by Don's attitude there was no chance he'd got a burst of machine gun through his tummy. And he gave him some morphine and his pain, and I stayed with him for, it was about 10 o'clock at that time, and I stayed with him until 4 o'clock in the morning, talking about things. He was conscious sometimes and working, and we talked about the good times and the bad times. That he was a great brother and a great soldier. On our way over, I had a premonition that I was going to lose him. Never dreaming that another about 8 or 10 days or 12 days onwards, I'd be holding him in his hand while we talked about things.
There were many feats of courage displayed by the men at Isarava. Military medals were won by Corporal Charlie McCallum and Private Lindsay Bear, but it was the courageous action of Private Bruce Kingsbury that won the only Victoria Cross during the Kokoda campaign.
Memories of your bitter struggle against the enemy, being severely outnumbered, the loss of mates, the hardships you endured. We are proud of you. We thank you, and we pay tribute to you for saving Australia. We are free.
George Palmer was photographed by Damien Parer.
For many years now, people have said to me, how did you come to get into that picture, and was it really as bad as it looks? But Damien said to us, he was on the side of a hill alongside us, he said, righto fellas, get as deep in the mud as you can. He said, we want to make this look really good.
And the Japs lost, hundreds of in those assaults and attacks, but we had our casualties too. And by the 29th of August, it was obvious that Colonel Key and Ralph Honour was still there of the 39th Battalion, and it was decided that we would withdraw to a better position, and that we'd almost had to give up any possibility that we could have any hope of retaking Kokoda because of the relative strengths.
But finally, under relentless pressure, the Australians had to withdraw from Isarava. They made their way south through heavy jungle to Eora Creek, where a field dressing station had been established. Damien Parer shot this graphic footage of the chaotic situation at Eora Creek as the wounded were streaming down from the battle at Isarava. Eora Creek was as far north on the track as Damien travelled, as a general withdrawal was ordered by Brigadier Potts, commander of the Australian forces in the area at that time. Whilst filming these dramatic scenes, Parer was accompanied by journalist Osmar White and ABC correspondent Chester Wilmot, who was to write a thorough analysis of the situation for General Rao, commander of the New Guinea force.
Damien had been a liaison officer for General Rao. Not just Damien, but also Chester Wilmot. Now, it had to be done very secretly. The idea, even though they were from the ABC and from the Department of Information, the fact of the matter is that correspondents are not supposed to be liaison officers, but they were.
The extraordinary thing, however, was that Chester Wilmot himself wrote a series of critiques because he was at the front lines and he could see what was going wrong, and he wrote a series of very brilliantly articulated arguments for changing the way the battle was being fought, and they were so good that Sydney Roll attached them to some of his sit reps which were being sent back to HQ. So in spite of the fact that they were working under this censorship regime, the journalists were still influencing the way that many of the commanders were thinking.
That's another interesting thing about how the films actually came back to Australia. I mean, there was some question about whether they would actually safely get back to Australia, and some bright doctor had the idea of we'll put the films with our most precious cargo, which is our injured, and that's apparently how a lot of the films came back to Australia, with the injured on stretchers.
I doubt whether we'd know much about what went on in Papua New Guinea if it wasn't for Damien Parer. And looking back on it now, it's the work he did then was very important then, but now it's more important because he captured history. I mean, he threw away tripods and cameras to walk up the track to get shots or sequences or make films, because he realised how important this would be as part of Australian history.
I think that my father was able to get the kinds of images and pictures and notions and things that he was able to put in the films because he won the confidence of the people that he was photographing, his development as a cinematographer came through partly working with Max Dupain. He worked with Max as his assistant and was trained by Max. So he was trained as a good, particularly portrait still photographer. And I think my father initially went off with the first lot of troops and knew nothing about war or fighting and so on. He had no training, but he began, as he got more experience and saw more of the war, to see what happens logistically with armies and what happens in terms of justice and injustice, and he saw what happened to prisoners of war. And I think that he started to take a more political stance on these things, and he began to realise that if you believe in something you have to stand up and say it. My mother always said that he was an ordinary fellow who did the best he could, who had a strong religious belief, who had a strong belief as an Australian, and who was a professional man who did his job well. It seems to me that the First World War is symbolised by Anzac and Anzac Cove, and Second World War seems to be symbolised now by the Kokoda campaign, which was the first time we turned the Japanese back and so on. And I think also that there are so many remarkable images that my father shot around that as a reference point, that it allows Australians now to try and get some sense of who they are and what happened during that period.
You know, the troubles he would have faced as a cameraman relative to what the crew that's been with us has faced must have just been phenomenal. And to have battled through that and still managed to have produced a film that can win an Academy Award, I think is a journey in itself and a battle in itself.
How pitifully small is our sacrifice compared with theirs. For some, all they had to give. For others, a darkness that may have no ending.
If these pictures can convey to you even a vague idea of the extent of their sacrifice, if they can put into your mind but a fraction of the deep respect and admiration I have for them, then the little I've been able to do is more than worthwhile.
We know that he actually broke a story on the newsreels. Now, that was not usual. Newsreels came after the stories had been broken, either on the radio or in the newspapers. Parer had rushed down and got a story on the screen that was new and was fresh. And in fact, I think the broadcasts and Osmer White's dispatches came a little later. So that was tremendously important. I mean, we have the beginnings of visuals now breaking stories, which of course happens all the time now. But that was one of the first times it happened.
The Trek party now move on and head further south, towards the Kokoda Gap and Mount Bellamy, the highest point on the track. From here it's a steady descent all the way down to Myola, and then on towards Brigade Hill. In 1942, Myola was used as a staging post where stores could be airdropped to the troops. Bill Graydon and Keith Norrish have taken the opportunity to return to Brigade Hill, the site of their bloody bayonet charge against the Japanese. They will try to determine the exact location where the action took place.
That looked very familiar, but this is not the area where we formed up for this bayonet attack. And it's not the area where we attacked from the rear.
When you came back from the rear.
So we'll go back to the starting point and see where we go from there.
Went on to Brigade Hill, Yafogi, and there we had another big battle and a stand-up on the Brigade Hill and Mission Ridge there. The 2nd 27th, fortunately, by this time had come forward, and they had the forward positions on the Brigade Hill, and they took the first brunt or the attacks from the Japanese, and we were still outnumbered, 6,000 to roughly about 1,500. Our people our numbers had dropped to about 1,500. And they were able to send, they had a few renegade natives that led the Japs around the track on our western side through the gullies, and they got a battalion on to cut the line between brigade headquarters and our 3 forward battalions.
We've got to find a fairly wide area there. And
So
then that would be the saddle. But
we're going into the saddle now, and we're probably, as we go up, is the first of the Japanese positions.
Oh, I see. Well, that might be more like it.
And they kept that line you wrote, which means...
How we ever did it.
Does it look
right to you, Bill?
It doesn't look right. Something gone wrong.
We were on fairly open country, and we could see lights coming across from Kargi at night.
Oh, that might have been further
Yeah, the Mission Spur, you can see all that.
Yeah.
If you cut these trees down, you'd see all that.
Oh, yeah.
What was that?
I said, how the bloody hell did we ever fight in this country? Effectively.
What made them think it was here?
The saddle made us think it was here, the monument, and that's where the dead were put.
Yeah,
and they would have only moved them a short period. That was our guessing.
Yes.
These bodies would be putrid.
I would think.
And they wouldn't want to move them very far, so they would have gone to the first possible place to have their initial internment.
Unless it's further on. But
then, it might be on the other side of that clearing. That's what I'm starting to think now.
I'm for sure it'll have to be.
Yeah.
Keith, it's just not the position.
No connection at all.
No, none at all.
Okay.
Ross thinks it could be on the other side of that saddle. It was a feeling of disappointment. We didn't get the actual spot where the engagement took place, but we think it we're very, very sure it's only a short distance down the hill. But we can say positively that this area that they thought was where the engagement took place is not the area. We can say that absolutely definitely for a number of reasons.
With the weather closing in, there's just enough time to get the veterans off Brigade Hill and back to Port Moresby. Unfortunately for the film crew, weather conditions will not allow the pilot to return to transport them back to the main trek party, who are still a day's walk away to the north.
So what do we get? We got a half a sandwich. What have you got?
I forgot.
Is that it? An orange, an apple, and a piece of chicken.
Piece of chicken. What's this? Fruit? Orange, apple, and cake. Gonna save this for this evening when I get really cold.
Yeah, and no sleeping bags, no tent, no nothing. And a long walk.
With no communications, the party decides to walk to a fogey village and stay there until the main party catches up. The crew finally arrive at a fogey village before dark and take up residence in the old patrol officer's hut.
I guess what got me going originally was when I first walked the track in 1999. We walked past all these places where I knew, I'd read in the history books that 100 Australians had died at a particular spot. And I said to the guide, where did it happen? You know, where was this? And all I got was a shrug of the shoulders, and it culminated when we got up to Brigade Hill, and we knew definitely that somewhere in the area, we'd read that 88 Australians had died in one day, and we still didn't know where any of these events had taken place, and I just thought that wasn't good enough for Australian history.
No wonder we all waved when we weighed in at the...
Sure enough, the next day the main trek party reaches a fogey village and the journey can be resumed.
The Japanese people, they dropped the bomb, big bomb, down at Naduri and destroy the house and kill the pigs. Mother and father, they take me away from there.
Bill Graydon called bayonet attack went through at 4 p.m. Of the 100 and something men who started that advance, only 11 made it through. The others were either killed, wounded or still pinned down by the Japanese in this lodgement area.
The Japanese at Brigade Hill, it's hard to explain, but they just kept coming, and didn't matter what you did, and how much firepower. Somehow they just kept coming, and there's your mate here, and 2 seconds later he's not there. He's gone. And how, you know, you're trying to, gee, there's my mate, he's gone, and then you still got to keep fighting, because if you don't, you'll be with your mate.
Brigadier Potts said, "The track's still not clear. I want Langridge, will you take your men back?" Langridge knew that it was a suicide mission, and he just took off his dog tags, took out his paybook, handed it to another chap, and silently walked off with his men, knowing that the chance of him coming back was just about zero, and he didn't come back. Both he and his second-in-command, Louis Lambert, were shot as they walked back into the Japanese position. Yeah, it's an incident that will always be remembered, I think.
He's really quite communicative and talkative.
How's that, Jenny?
A long day. Fast walking for the last 3.5 hours.
How was today?
But good. Hard day over. It's great. Been a great trek.
What time to start?
6:30 this morning.
And it's
5:30.
11 hours.
Yeah, I'm dying to get in that creek and soak my feet.
The Perers have found the perfect location to fix the plaque dedicated to Damien and the men of Kokoda. Damien shot the final sequence for his film Kokoda Front Line in the nearby village of Minari.
Well, this is the village of Minari, and as you can see, a little different from what it would have been like through the war. There's a church service going on in the background here. Like many places on the track, there's some conjecture as to whether this was the site of the wartime Minari. However, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it is. The wartime maps, for example, army surveys of the region suggest that this is the area, and certainly the written descriptions of people such as Jeff Redding seem to describe this locality perfectly. It's significant because here in early September, just prior to the battle at Brigade Hill, the 39th Militia Battalion filed through the village. Their new commander, Ralph Honour, had taken over at Isarava, and he thought that they'd performed brilliantly, and he paraded the 39th here to give them his thanks. Just at this time, Damien Parer walked into the village, and Parer saw the significance of the moment and asked Honour if he could film the 39th and his address. Honour suggested to Parer that his men should have time to clean up and before being captured on film, but Parer refused, saying that he thought he should film the men the way they were. And in my opinion, it resulted in one of the most moving pieces of cinematography to come out of the Second World War.
Who have upheld the proudest traditions of the Australian Army. They have suffered fearful privations, fighting day and night. Their casualties have not been light, but they've carried on. This is war, the real thing. The utter weariness of sorely tried men is evident in their faces, but they've won their spurs. Quietly they accept praise for the job they've done, but they don't forget the cobbers who did not come back with them.
Right. On this Parer family Kokoda track,
We have spoken many times of Damien, of the courageous acts he has done, of the example he has given us, and we place this plaque here in memory of Damien.
Screams, whistles, gunshots in the night. The horizon is dark, mountain guns flashing bright over the range. Love you, Mom, and I miss you, Dad. I fear I won't return. Jesus, my time's at hand. Help me stand.
This is the Eora Ridge. Just to get your geography in perspective, Moresby's this way, probably about, I would say, 75 kilometres to the coast. There are glimpses actually of the Gulf of Papua if you could look through the tree canopy here away to your right. So even though the Australians weren't pushed off the ridge by the advancing Japanese, the Japanese probed the Australian positions all along the ridge line, and the new Australian commander, Ken Ether, telephoned back to Port Moresby asking for permission to make one final withdrawal. His general, Tubby Allen, said to him, "Okay, Ken, you've got permission to fall back to Imata, but that's it. There'll be no more withdrawals, and if necessary, you and your men will die on Imata." And he said, I understand that, sir. And the Australians did effect their withdrawal on the 16th and 17th of September. The Japanese then advanced and took occupation of the ridge, and it's believed that about 5,000 Japanese occupied this whole ridge line. General Horry was camped over there near Eora, and it wasn't soon after that a signalman came with an order from Rabaul to pull back out of the Owen Stanley. What were the reasons for the defeat? Well, there were several. Their lines of support are simply overextended. They were totally out of provisions. But most importantly was the fighting withdrawal that the Australians had put into effect. The Japanese had expected to come here within 2 weeks. It took them 2 months. They landed on the 21st of July, and it wasn't till the 3rd week of September that they actually got here. So whilst the Australians hadn't won each of the individual delaying actions, cumulatively, time was a factor. And time cost the Japanese and led to their defeat. Australian patrols came forward across the valley, and I'm sure Japanese patrols patrolled the next valley system here, and there might have been individual clashes, but eventually the Japanese pulled out quietly on about the 23rd or 24th of September, and Australian patrols coming forward came right to the ridge on the 26th of September and couldn't believe it when they found the entire ridge unoccupied. They sent patrols forward for a day but still didn't find any Japanese. So on the 27th of September the Australian advance commenced.
By this stage in the war, the Japanese found themselves hopelessly overextended and had lost major naval engagements in the Pacific. They were forced to abandon the New Guinea campaign in favour of consolidating their position in nearby Guadalcanal. A few days before the Japanese retreat, General Blamey, under mounting pressure from General MacArthur and Prime Minister John Curtin, arrived in Port Moresby. After being made aware that the Japanese were now a spent force, he sacked General Rail, with whom he had continuing disagreements, and took command himself, appointing his own staff officers to key positions in the New Guinea command. The Australian counterattack, led by Major General Tubby Allen, now successfully pushed the Japanese back along the Kokoda track to the north coast, where they began their assault some 2 months earlier. However, General MacArthur wanted faster results, whatever the cost.
Allen, who was the most experienced infantry commander at that time in either the US or the Australian Army, he was hounded by Blamey and MacArthur, and he said their ignorance of the country was myopic. They thought I could just go round the flanks with a single brigade. I was determined I was not going to murder my men by letting them put me in a panic. And they actually criticised him for not having enough casualties.
After Allen's counterattack succeeded in driving the Japanese back along the track, the Australians re-entered Kokoda village on the 2nd of November. The Australian flag was raised again. However, Allen, the architect of the victory, was not there to salute it, having also been sacked by General Blamey. His replacement, General Vasey, gave a speech of thanks acknowledging the victory as Allen's and thanked the native carriers, without whom, he said, they would never have been able to cross the Owen Stanley Range.
So it was a full 6 months from the date that the Japanese landed on the north coast to the time that they were pushed back to the north coast by the advancing Australians. By this stage there were still estimates of between 5,000 or 6,000 Japanese forming part of that retreating force, and they took up positions on the northern beaches where they had landed 6 months before at Gona, Sanananda and Boona, and they had defensive positions some 2 or 3 kilometres inland from those landing beaches as well, and very strong. They'd had 6 months to build up their fortifications on the beaches, log bunkers, major defence works, trenches, machine gun posts, an almost World War I type Hindenburg line defensive locality. And the Australians advanced against these entrenched positions. They were thrown piecemeal into the battle. There were very few reconnaissance patrols. They had no accurate estimation of the Japanese defence forces they were up against, and like the rest of their campaign, grossly underestimated intelligence estimates of the strength of the Japanese defenders. And the results were horrific. Some 1,500 Australians lost their lives in the area from north of the ranges until they finally pushed the Japanese off those beaches.
Under constant pressure from General MacArthur, General Blamey continued with his retribution, sacking Brigadier Arnold Potts and then calling his 21st Brigade to parade before him at a place called Koitaki.
I was present at the speech that General Blamey had called, the parade that he'd called for our battalion or our brigade to form up as a parade to get we all considered that we were going to get complimented for the wonderful performance that our brigade had put up against the Japanese in delaying and stopping and defeating them on that advance and track where they've eventually had to withdraw a defeated army. And he started off with his rhetoric, and we expected to be complimented, but it was as though, some burst of artillery fired landed amongst our troops when he said, "Yeah, well, you've been defeated," and so forth. You've been defeated by an army with inferior numbers and inferior weapons. We're just horrified at what he had to say. There's no question that I know others, there's one or two officers that have tried to say that he didn't mean to say this and so forth, but that's not correct. It's not the words he used, and it's not the word. And he said it's the rabbit that when he runs he gets shot and so forth, and suggested that we'd run and cowards. Ralph Honour, who I was adjutant to, he wrote an article, he called it the Koitaki incident, and he felt that a lot of the casualties that the brigade suffered at Gona and the beachhead were caused through that misguided tirade that Blamey gave us at Koitaki. A lot of our veterans, that they know for sure that a lot of them sort of threw their lives away on these sort of charge into against positions they never had time or an opportunity to pinpoint the blockhouses and the dugouts that the Japanese had prepared for months beforehand at Gona and Piota, and just slaughter. All a great hurry. I mean, they wanted to get a quick victory. MacArthur and Blamey wanted to get a quick victory, and they didn't care how many lives they lost in the meantime.
Don't ask me why somebody didn't shoot him there and then. I don't know.
I know it was an appalling statement from a man in his position, and he has never been forgiven for it.
The fast-flowing Goldie River marks the end of the track and the adventure of a lifetime for many of the Parer group. Two years to the day after the documentary Kokoda Frontline premiered in Australia, Damien Parer was found dead, shot by a Japanese machine gunner on a beach in Peleliu in southwest Pacific. His camera lying nearby, his last frame showing a violent skyward pan.
War's hell, and it's just hell. And because we're talking now, I hope people don't think we're trying to glorify war. What we're trying to do is let people know what went on, and these men, how they sacrificed their life so that we now can live like we can,
It's here at the Bamana War Cemetery, just outside Port Moresby, where we see the scale of the heroic yet tragic sacrifice of the men of Kokoda. If the Gallipoli campaign in World War I was Australia's first military test as a new nation, the Kokoda campaign was the first time that Australians defended their own shores. The enemy was turned back and defeated, but the cost was great, with nearly 5,500 Australians killed or wounded. Perhaps the last words should be left to the poet, scholar and soldier, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honour, in his own funeral oration for the men of Kokoda. The storms and thunderings are quiet now, The Furies have faded from the scene. The heroes are dead, the tragedy is finished. The carping critic of Koitaki is silenced too. His words can wound no more. But the undying deeds of the valiant he defamed proclaim their constant courage to all posterity. Amen.
11 weeks in and the rations are almost gone. Our original battalion size dwindles as the days go on. They're coming streaming through the valley now. We're dug in on the mountainsides, mud, blood and sweat on our brow.